Breaking news today on Sekulow is top ISIS leader taken out by U.S. Special Forces.
Keeping you informed and engaged, now more than ever. This is Sekulow. We want to hear from you. Share and post your comments or call 1-800-684-3110. And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
Hey, welcome to Sekulow. We are taking your phone calls, 1-800-684-3110. That's 1-800-684-3110. And in positive news, in the war on terror, a group which, again, we haven't spoken about a lot. They have not posed as much of a threat to the U.S. or our forces since that their leader was taken out. But they have tried to reconstitute in Syria and North Africa. That's the Islamic State, ISIS. So they have not given up that banner. Their leader was in northwest Syria and was located by our special forces and intelligence. They knew exactly where he was. He was cornered in a building, and he decided to blow himself up rather than be taken by the U.S. Special Forces. But an incredible job. Listening to reports this morning coming out of this, just to kind of explain to you how in-depth the intel was on this specific individual. When they utilized special forces, no U.S. casualties, is that they knew that the building he was in, he might not have known. He might have thought he was going to cause a lot more destruction with his suicide vest. But instead, they knew enough about the building to know that he likely did not have enough explosives strapped to him to take out the whole building.
Which means the intel was.
And they were able to evacuate most of the area. But this, again, shows you that even with things with the administration seem dicey every day, especially with foreign policy, our special forces and our military, when they're able to do their job and be unleashed, are able to take out systematically these terrorist leaders, which then it causes a lot of disruption to these terrorist groups.
So the leader was the actual replacement for al-Baghdadi. So this was the number one ISIS terrorist, Ibrahim al-Hashimi. He was killed by our special operations. What is interesting, Joe, we talked about this before we went on air. We had in Syria, where this took place, you had U.S. special operating forces, special ops forces, and you also had Russian special operation forces there, Wes, at the same time. Yes. Not in the same exact spot.
Right.
But both U.S. troops and Russian troops were on the ground in Syria.
Yeah, on opposite sides, as far as that goes. They support, the president of Syria. And we do not. And interestingly enough, this guy was killed in Idlib, which is the area, the province that's held by our allies, by the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's their area. So he was hiding in an area that really is under the control of Syrian Democratic Forces and where we have U.S. forces stationed. And this operation, kudos to the administration for keeping it quiet until it was done. And kudos to our soldiers who did an excellent job. They went in with a loudspeaker and an Arabic translator telling women and children to evacuate. They did all they could to minimize civilian casualties. It appears the 10 civilians that were killed, it was 6 women, 4 children, were actually killed by the terrorist himself as he blew himself up.
Yeah. So this was a great operation by the United States military, our special forces, and we want to thank them and all the men and women that are serving our country anywhere that they're deployed. This was a major operation and a major operational success. There's also, we're going to get in this next segment, there's some information coming out of Afghanistan, that information about what took place there. Not so encouraging, I would say. Than, this is something that you would think Congress would be looking at. We are looking at it. We filed a FOIA request and are now in federal court on it, but we'll get into more. But your thoughts?
Well, we're doing an answer for that in just a few days. But from the very beginning with that Afghanistan withdrawal, we wanted to know why things like evacuating Americans, evacuating allies, evacuating our equipment, why those things weren't handled before the actual withdrawal took place. Jay, this information you're going to get into it gives us a peek into that why.
You know what, folks, we're going to continue, too. If you've got phone calls about ISIS, phone calls about this new information on the Afghan withdrawal, you know what, they were going up the day before Kabul fell. They were still planning meetings at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul for the next day. Of course, that day, instead of having meetings, they were evacuating the embassy. Give us a call, 1-800-684-3110. You see how the military can do its job. But our diplomats, and we talked about this with Rick Grinnell yesterday, it's like they're not doing their job. They're not doing their work. We'll be right back on Sekulow.
will not conduct a hasty rush to the exit. We'll do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely. And we will do it in full coordination with our allies and partners.
But a few months later, as Taliban fighters were descending upon Kabul, the Biden administration was scrambling to figure out what to do.
That's according to leaked notes from a White House Situation Room meeting as compiled by NSC officials that Axios has obtained.
Leaked notes from a national security deputies meeting on August 14th, one day before Kabul fell, indicate the Biden administration had not yet finalized where to evacuate thousands of Americans and allied Afghans. The notes obtained by Axios read, quote, "State will work to identify as many countries as possible to serve as transit points. Transit points need to be able to accommodate U.S. citizens, Afghan nationals, third country nationals, and other evacuees."
These documents finally highlight that the Biden administration was making these really crucial and numerous decisions, again, just hours before Kabul fell.
And it's not just the withdrawal, by the way. In the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo and our team, we negotiated what we thought was going to be a peaceful end to the war in Afghanistan. So we were also not arguing that we needed to keep troops in Afghanistan for forever. But what we were arguing was a responsible withdrawal.
I don't blame a lot of our allies for losing faith in our ability to stand strong with them, shoulder to shoulder. Leaving Afghanistan the way that we did, unprepared and not ready to be there for our allies when they needed us most, just shows the type of character that we have at the highest level of our administration.
Biden ignored the intelligence, or he didn't pay attention to it, or maybe he just didn't believe it. I don't know the answer. But they clearly played down the threat up until they withdrew troops. They decided to withdraw them during the middle of fighting season. They decided to close bases and to take out American troops before making sure that every American was out of Afghanistan.
All right, welcome back to Sekulow. We are taking your phone calls, too, as well. If you want to give us a call in the air, 1-800-684-3110. Kind of these dueling stories. You have a very positive story. See, when our military is able to act unrestrained, they're able to make the decisions. They're able to put the intelligence together. We can take out these terrorist leaders. And, again, praise to our military for an excellent Special Forces mission, taking out the #1 ISIS leader. This was the person who replaced Baghdadi. And again, ISIS was trying to reconstitute. While the Trump administration effectively destroyed the caliphate, there were still actors trying to reconstitute under the ISIS banner in both Syria and North Africa. Their leader is now dead. So what it's showing to these terrorist groups is that we are still watching you, and we can take you out before you have a chance to become a Baghdadi, before you have a chance to create a mini caliphate and start taking actual property, because that's what ISIS is about. ISIS is not al-Qaeda hiding in the caves. ISIS, their whole thing is, we want a caliphate, we want to take land, we want to take cities, we want to run them, we want to be in charge. And again, because of our special forces in northwest Syria, no U.S. casualties, and an ISIS leader is surrounded by our special forces, and the reporting is he had a suicide vest on, and he decided rather than be taken by special forces, likely killed by special forces, he would detonate that vest, thought he was going to do a lot more damage. They were able to clear the area and knew that he did not have, that just tells you about when intelligence is good, knew that he didn't have enough explosives to take down the building.
So I was going to ask you this, Wes. So when we're talking about a special operations unit like this that was operating, what goes in? Obviously don't disclose anything, but what goes into this? What are they doing? It's a combination of intelligence, on ground, off in a central command center. How does it all work?
Yeah, they coordinate heavily. Special forces always do with our intelligence people, and we have intelligence operatives on the ground in Syria that are both planted by the U.S. and also Syrian assets as well there. So there's a lot of coordination and planning. And then anytime you have an operation like this, your special forces guy, they do what we used to call in the military rock drills. They actually go through and they will set up a mock building or mock encampment, and they will practice. This is how we will go in. This will be our points of entry. If we need to escape, this is our points of exit. They go in and they actually physically rehearse this before they do it. And again, kudos to the military.
So do you think they knew that there was a good possibility that he was going to detonate himself at some point?
I think so, because some reports are saying that he that people thought he had enough explosives to bring down the whole building. He did not, and apparently we knew that. We knew that, exactly.
Which is that's impressive intelligence. Here's what President Biden had to say. This is number 8.
As our troops approached to capture the terrorist, in a final act of desperate cowardness, he, with no regard to the lives of his own family or others in the building, he chose to blow himself up, not just to the vest, but to blow up that 3rd floor, rather than face justice for the crimes he has committed, taking several members of his family with him, just as his predecessor did.
So what's interesting to me, and I appreciate that our military did such a great job on this, and I think the important thing and the important message, and this would be the message to the entire world, we may have political discourse here that is aggressive and people are on all sides of the issues, but when it comes to protecting the interests, and by the way, you take out ISIS because not only is it destabilizing to the Middle East, it is destabilizing to the world. I mean, ISIS terrorists have done acts in the United States. We took out the number 1 guy under the last president, and then we took out the number 1 guy on the current president. Republican, Democrat, in that sense, it didn't matter because we had the intelligence, we had the capability. So I want to say a thank you to everyone serving that was able to see this. Now, I say that because you wish every operation would move in that kind of way. But there's information coming out on the Afghanistan withdrawal that has Senator Richard Blumenthal. You want to set this up, Jordan? Upset.
Yes, you've got a very liberal U.S. Senator, Democrat from Connecticut, but is on the Senate Armed Forces Committee. And this new information came out through Axios. It's unclassified, but it was about the National Security Council staff on August 14th. Dates are very important here, so I want to explain the dates. On August 14th, there's a deputy small group. They met for 1 hour to talk about the relocations out of Afghanistan, so getting the Americans out, getting the special visa holders out of Afghanistan. And they were still meeting about this on August 14th, to the point where they said, let's have another meeting tomorrow. And they were still working with the embassy in Kabul on August 15th, except for Kabul fell to the Taliban on August 15th. So people are saying they were rushing their plans together, or this was a situation where their intelligence was very bad, or they were ignoring the reality on the ground. Because I can't imagine how you couldn't figure out that the Taliban was on your doorstep on August 14th if they were literally going to take the city August 15th. And basically what was they walked in. I mean, it was not like super violent. They walked in and took over the city. And what did this lead to, though? Ultimately, this poor planning. Not the fault of our troops, but remember, 13 U.S. troops killed by supposedly ISIS-K, which was another ISIS group reconstituting in Afghanistan. And we were trusting the Taliban to protect our troops from ISIS-K. And, of course, 13 U.S. troops were killed. But it shows some serious mismanagement at the diplomatic level.
Well, I mean, to the point of negligence.
Yeah.
I mean, they're having meetings on August 14th talking about the priority. Now, this is August 14th. The next day, Kabul's gone. And the Taliban are in control. The day before, they're trying to figure out this. Well, what level of person should we evacuate and in what order? And they're discussing it. They haven't come to final conclusions.
Well, an example, there's a lot of documents here. In the meeting on the 14th, they had just decided that they needed to notify local Afghan staff. On the 14th.
The day before
on the 15th, our embassy was evacuated. Kabul was gone. Taken by the Taliban.
So this shows you. Now, we filed a...
So when they say they had a plan and it just didn't work, no, they didn't. They did not have a plan.
Well, they were doing the planning, unfortunately, the day before the whole country fell.
Yeah.
And it fell into the hands of the Taliban. So we filed on August 30th a demand letter with the State Department, with the Director of Information Office Management, the Department of Defense, the Secretary, Office of the Secretary and Joint Staff, and also the U.S. Central Command. I want to, before we get into the details, people say, why would you file with the U.S. Central Command? You want to explain CENTCOM?
Yeah, CENTCOM is the combatant command that is in charge of all of that region of the world. The combatant commands control different regions of the world. And CENTCOM is commanded by a 4-star general, and they're in charge of all military operations and much of the intelligence gathering for that part of the world.
So our request sought records pertaining to communications, knowledge, and efforts surrounding the failure unfolding in Afghanistan and the communications had between agencies in the months leading up to the national security and humanitarian catastrophe that took place, and we give specific examples. Then documents are being released which are showing what was going on, and here's the problem. The course then, the government did what they always do, no response. And we do what we always do, and put it up on the screen for those watching on our social media platforms. We filed in federal court. United States District Court for the District of Columbia, American Center for Law and Justice versus the United States Department of the State, United States Office of Director of National Intelligence, that's Rick Grinnell's old office, and the United States Department of Defense, and of course CENTCOM, as we said. And the answer to this complaint is due in just a few days by the federal government. Dan?
Yeah, we had no response, so we filed a lawsuit. We'd have to do this in most of these cases, Jay. And look, in a nutshell, I actually think if you boil all the questions that we've demanded answers to, I think we're looking for the answer to the question that Jordan posed just a minute ago. I mean, clearly there was intelligence that showed that a takeover of Kabul was going to happen. So did they, A, not know, or B, did they ignore it? And Jay, look, I mean, I just can't believe that 24 hours, they were only 24 hours away and they didn't know. No, I think they chose to ignore it. You know, the other thing here, Jay, and I think this is what Senator Blumenthal is so upset about. Let's say you're the commander-in-chief. Let's say you've done the deliberative process and you have decided that you are going to withdraw. Whether you agree or disagree with that, let's say that is the conclusion that you have arrived at. Well, if you don't have the things nailed down, that these leaked notes show were nailed down, Jay, you have to adjust. You can't leave yet. You can still leave later, but you have to do it in an orderly fashion. And if you don't, what happens? It costs lives. And in this case, it cost American lives and it cost the lives of allies on the ground.
I hear from military men and women that are listening to this broadcast right now and get the reaction of both of these stories.
Yeah, especially because I know there's a lot of you listening right now who served in Afghanistan or had a husband or a wife who served in Afghanistan or a child who served in Afghanistan. And while this information is still coming to light about why the withdrawal was such a botched disaster, we've got Democrats upset about it. We come back to the break. We didn't get to it yet. I mean, liberal Democrats who we don't usually agree with. Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut. But again, they are outraged as well because it put our military in a horrendous situation. The diplomatic blunders and not believing the intel or bad intel led to our military being in a dangerous situation where they were relying on the Taliban in those final days to protect them from outside terrorist groups. And guess what? That didn't work. 13 U.S. troops were killed. We'll be right back on Sekulow. Take your phone calls. 1-800-684-3110.
Yeah, we've got a lot more on this. There's some interesting information, folks. Give us a call. If you served in the military, we want to hear from you. 800-684-3110.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
The first big city to fall was Kunduz. One after another, Afghanistan's biggest cities outside of Kabul were captured. Herat to the west.
Terrorists in Kabul carrying out the deadliest attack on U.S. troops in over a decade. Afghanistan is lost.
Freedom came under attack. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
At my direction, a small team of Americans carried out the operation with extraordinary courage. They killed Osama bin Laden.
Al-Baghdadi is dead.
It's time to end America's longest war. We'll do it responsibly.
Rushing to the airport, behind them, the sound of gunfire.
Deliberately.
Countless Afghans who helped American troops were left behind.
And safely.
Afghans by the thousands desperate to escape life under the Taliban.
Ultimately, we're dealing with an ideology. It took decades to defeat communism and fascism. It's going to take a long time to defeat the idea of Islamic extremism.
This Islamist jihadist threat that is posed to us, the American people, our country, they're very much alive and well and thriving.
All right, so we talked about the fact that, and welcome back to Sekulow, and we are taking your phone calls. We really want to hear from people who are in the military or did serve, because there's generations of people who served in the in Afghanistan, and maybe it's your husband, maybe it's your wife, maybe it's you, because there's new information coming to light about how the diplomats on the ground were botching this up until the last moment. They were planning on the day before Kabul fell to the Taliban. They were planning on having more meetings with our embassy in Kabul. And they weren't talking about the embassy at the airport at that point. They were talking about the actual embassy. The next day, the embassy was evacuated. They had just decided on the day before Kabul fell that they should start letting our Afghan allies, those special visa holders who could immigrate to the U.S., to start letting them know to prepare to leave.
Yeah, they didn't actually. That meeting was the day before it fell.
Yeah.
They hadn't put it in. They didn't say this is the plan. We've now executed the plan.
We need to do this now.
I think we need to do this. So let's get this ready to do. It was not where it was put into action. Correct?
Let me play Senator Blumenthal, because this is not just Republican opposition and outrage over this. This is bipartisan. Take a listen. Bite 25.
I am deeply dissatisfied, in fact, downright upset with the laggard efforts in evacuating at-risk Afghan allies from that country. These men and women and their families put their lives on the line to protect our troops and diplomats, and we are failing to rescue them.
Listen, Dan, that's Richard Blumenthal, liberal Democrat, recognizing what we recognized back in August, that this was a debacle.
Yeah, Jay, let me just give a little insight into why the outrage from both Republicans and Democrats was pretty universal. When this happened, Jay, all of their offices were literally flooded with constituents who had either friends or family still in harm's way and who were just aghast that the United States government was leaving them behind. Look, a lot of those constituents thought that leaving Afghanistan was an okay idea, but they just could not wrap their minds around, like we couldn't, the idea that we would leave without getting the people who had fought, whether they were Americans or our allies, behind. That's why the outpouring was so universal. And I'll just say this, Jay, even here at the ACLJ today, as we speak, we continue to monitor some very specific cases on the ground. Some of them are resolving, yes, others are not. And even now, at this late date, people like Senator Blumenthal have dozens of open cases inside their office. I'd almost be willing to guarantee it. I've been through this process before. They were flooded with real situations. This was not some hypothetical, theoretical policy decision. This impacted people's lives on the ground, and these senators felt it in a very personal way.
Yeah, I mean, we got some calls coming in, 1-800-684-3110. Mary Ellen from Illinois, online one. Hey, Mary Ellen, welcome to Sekulow. You're on the air.
Oh, hello, everyone. Yes, as I hear Senator Blumenthal's name first surfacing now, how many months after August 15th, it's like, how come we didn't hear his name back August 15th going forward, not just now?
Yeah, I mean, so Dan, everybody could see on the ground that it was horrendous. But I do think we have to go back to August. We probably have to look, because there was a lot of a bipartisan discussion about how bad the withdrawal was.
There was, Jordan. I think after the fact, I think when people were actually left behind, I actually thought the level of bipartisan outrage was pretty significant, especially in this divided town. I thought it was good. Now, here's where I do think some criticism is warranted here, and I think maybe Mary Ellen is alluding to this. In the lead-up, Jordan, the president's party needed to insist he do better. I mean, look, I think most of these people, I don't remember for sure about Senator Blumenthal, but my guess is he probably thought that the withdrawal decision was a good one. But look, you can't set a date certain, and then if the rubrics that are required to actually implement that withdrawal are not met, Jordan, you've got to adjust. You've got to push it back. You can't turn security over to the Taliban and just throw up your arms and lose American lives, and that's essentially what happened.
And I want to be fair and honest about that, what Dan is talking about, because this is goes back, again, a Democrat, Jean Shaheen, New Hampshire, U.S. Senator. She got asked today as well on MSNBC about this information. Take a listen. She said she didn't agree with any of it from the get-go.
What is your reaction
to this latest reporting? And are you satisfied with what we have seen in the wake of the withdrawal? Has there been enough attention on women and children?
Well, I think no. I think we need to do more to think about how we can support women and girls in Afghanistan. And it's no secret that I was not supportive of the president's decision to withdraw and was uncomfortable with the way that was carried out.
And we now know also, and Wes is going to address this, that it wasn't just members of the Republicans and Democrats in the Senate that were concerned about this, but the generals that were in charge.
Oh, yeah. This was not a military debacle. This was a White House State Department debacle. And if you recall back in the fall after all this transpired, we had some of our top generals from CENTCOM, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the vice chairman, the secretary of defense, who testified before Congress that they did not recommend this operation to unfold the way it did. They were against this. The president tried to say early on, all of his generals concurred, and they disputed that because they told him, that they were not ready. They wanted to hold Bagram Airfield for a while longer and not use the airport in Kabul as an exit point, all kinds of things like that. The military, their hands were tied in this case. And what we're witnessing here, what we witnessed back in August, is an absence of planning, not letting the military do what they do best. And also, as Stan alluded to, a commitment to a certain date to leave, even though they weren't prepared to leave on that date and the mission was not ready to be executed. The president and the administration, they overestimated the ability of the Afghan National Army to defend their own country. They underestimated the strength of the Taliban. And keep this in mind, Jay, this came out last fall, too. The Taliban, they were talking with our representatives at the State Department, and they offered to stay out of Kabul, to let us control it until we got everyone out. And the administration refused to take control of the city, and they voluntarily let the Taliban come in because they thought we could all escape from the Kabul airport. Yet on the day before, what are they doing? They're still discussing transit points to get people out of the country.
Folks, that's why we filed this. That's why you're in federal court. That's why your American Center for Law and Justice and our Office of really Government Oversight takes a very aggressive view on this. And we go to court to get the answers, because when you get the answers, you know what? You don't let it happen again, where you lose 13 men and women serving in our military and had a disastrous execution and removal of our troops. And now we know that the White House in the Situation Room, I know that room, been in that room, the Situation Room, they're meeting the day before Kabul fell to decide, Jordan, hey, who do we get out on what priority and when do we start notifying them? That was the day before.
Yeah, I mean,
12 hours later, it was gone. Probably that night, if you look at the time change.
And when that happened, you have to then understand the shift there. Instead of focusing in on our Afghan allies who were under serious threat, making sure they got out safely, like the Afghan girls soccer team, which eventually did get out, all those different groups that we said we would protect. We had set up in the U.S. ready to go. And also it looks like military bases that were being set up, ready to go. They should have already been set up. But think about it, by the next day, guess what? You're watching your own back and getting out. So it switched to where, I mean, if you're that embassy staff that was the remaining staff, you were getting out. And then we had to move our embassy to the airport, whatever that meant. It was a mess. And then the troops that we sent there, remember we sent additional troops to Afghanistan, and 13 ended up being killed trying to help people get to the airport, because we were relying on the Taliban, for goodness sakes, to provide security for U.S. troops from Islamic terrorist groups that wanted to kill U.S. troops like the Taliban. So, I mean, the whole effort, we talked about with Rick yesterday, our military is great at what they do. Our diplomats are failing us, and that makes it tough on the U.S. military, that much tougher.
Because of your support, because of the support of every member of the ACLJ, one of the practice areas that we've been able to develop is Freedom of Information Act requests, or FOIA requests.
It's thousands of pages of paper, and in those thousands of pages of paper, you usually find a nugget.
Government agencies acting out of control.
We have exposed that in our FOIA litigation, and we do that every day that we bring these cases.
It is your statutory right as an American citizen to have access to documents that reveal how the government is functioning, how your government is functioning.
We took it to the IRS. No one ever does that.
What the IRS was doing was violating the Constitution and statutory law. They can't do what they were doing before.
They've been hiding behind in the shadows. These FOIAs bring them to light.
How do we know? Because our FOIA litigation got that document.
Those of you that support the ACLJ, this is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Think we haven't been on this, folks? We've been on it.
Keeping you informed and engaged, now more than ever. This is Sekulow. And now your host, Jordan Sekulow.
So serious questions. I want to hear from those of you who have served in Afghanistan or had family who served in Afghanistan, because I know people were very upset when they saw the withdrawal. And we're starting to get more and more information. Now, we filed a FOIA, now a federal lawsuit, to get that information about why this was done in such a poor manner by the Biden administration, why they didn't listen to the intelligence almost a year out, not a full year out, but almost, 9 months out, saying you need to start doing this now when it comes to getting, if you want to leave Afghanistan, which there was a whole discussion about whether that was right or wrong, but if you want to leave, then you need to start doing this now. And so there's leaked documents out, Axios has posted them, and what they show is that the deputies of the National Security Council were meeting along with the people in the Kabul embassy, the diplomats there, on August 14th about a plan for the Afghans who had the special immigrant visas, the SIVs, to come to the U.S. That on the 14th they said, well, we need a plan to notify them to leave. On the 15th, Kabul fell, our embassy was evacuated to the airport, and all of the chaos ensued. We know about the chaos. But what we're now finding out is how early these warnings came, Wes. Yeah. Starting in, we're talking about, remember here we're talking about August. Mm-hmm. Warnings came almost the beginning of the year, in February.
Right after the president took office, Matt Zeller, who was a CIA officer, he's since retired from the CIA, he said, when all this broke over the last few days, he said they were talking with the administration about protecting Afghans who worked with Americans. And this is a quote from him. They treated us like we were Chicken Little. They did not believe the sky was falling. He goes on to say, on the 13th of July, we offered to work with them to help evacuate people from Afghanistan. We all saw this disaster coming before the inevitable occurred. This is 13 July. He says they did not get back to us on that request until August 15th, the day Kabul fell.
Think about the timing of this and what it says about what was going on, not about our military, because as we said at the first half hour, our military did a surgical strike against the replacement for al-Baghdadi. He's dead. He's done. So the military, as Jordan said, can execute. The problem is the political side of this, or the White House side of this, and the State Department side of this, our diplomats continue to fail on this. If information, as Wes just said, is available in February, and then you turn around and they say again in July, hey, we may want to do something about this, and then August 14th, they're meeting to decide what to do, and the country falls the next day.
Yeah, and Jay, the ramifications are just horrific. They really are. Jordan talked about the 13 Americans whose lives were lost as a direct consequence of these decisions. Jay, I think beyond that as well. I think probably if we went around the panel, we might have various views on when the best time to leave was. I personally think 20 years was probably way too long, but think about this. For 20 years, the reason that young girls were protected, could go to school, weren't given away as child brides, was because we were there providing them some protection. Jay, if we were going to pull back from that, those 20 years put a duty in place for us to protect those young girls. We failed on that front, Jay. We just did.
No, the consequences of it were not just 13 American soldiers killed, which was horrific, but also the Afghan assistants of ours that we'd left were, as Stan said, or the younger teenagers that were helping out and translating, or that went to school to be educated, and now they're subject to the Taliban and that rule. But it's a catastrophic failure of the White House and the State Department, Jordan, on all of this. Yeah. Not the military. We want to be clear on that.
No, that's the problem. They put the military in a horrible situation. So they added forces at the end in Afghanistan, and the 13 were killed. Men and women were killed. They were trying to, take care of children. And again, we talked about that with Rick Renell yesterday. That is not really the military's job. They are not. We've turned them into going into villages and towns to help build these relationships. That's what diplomats are supposed to do. We're supposed to have diplomats in places that are dangerous around the world. But there's this lack of engagement there on the diplomatic corps, which then puts our military in a horrendous and very difficult situation. Not that they won't go. They go. They put themselves in harm's way and try to do the best that they can for the people. They take their orders, they follow them. But remember, this debacle didn't just lead to Afghans being killed, but it led to American forces being killed in Afghanistan.
The president delivering remarks about a counterterrorism operation that took out a top ISIS leader.
That's right. Special Forces operations engaged in a raid to take out Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi.
He was wearing a suicide vest, which detonated during the raid.
There was a $10 million price tag on al-Qurayshi through the State Department. He had once been in U.S. custody in Iraq. ISIS has been largely decimated, but this and the ISIS attack on a Syrian prison to free fellow jihadists earlier this month show they still have an active presence.
It happened in the town of Atma, not far from the Turkish border. Reports from residents on the ground say the raid lasted 2 hours and involved helicopters, explosives, and machine gun fire.
This region of Syria, Idlib, is home to several senior al-Qaeda operatives and other extremist groups.
These were members of the Joint Special Operations Command. That is the most elite. They conduct the most dangerous missions. That can include the Army's Delta Force, Navy SEAL Team 6.
Witnesses on social media saying loudspeakers were used, urging women and children to leave the area. And this morning, according to a U.S. official, a U.S. military helicopter experienced a maintenance issue during the operation, and it was detonated on site.
There have been concerns about the resurgence of ISIS right now that has recently overrun a prison in northeast Syria. Again, the president watching it all take place in real time from the Situation Room.
As we start to focus on China, our biggest long-term threat, as we try and deal with the threat posed by Russia and Ukraine, we can't take our eye off the ball in the Middle East. We still have terrorist groups that pose a threat to the U.S. homeland, and the threat from Salafi jihadism more broadly, I fear, is going to grow worse in the wake of our embarrassing surrender in Afghanistan. It will also grow worse if this administration gets back into the Iran deal, which will create chaos in the Middle East.
All right, welcome back to Sekulow, too. If you want to talk to us on air, 1-800-684-3110. And I want to just reiterate, too, the ACLJ is taking action on this. Let me go to Than in Washington, D.C. Than, we're not just sitting back waiting for documents to be leaked by the news. We were really proactive going back to August. So just a couple weeks after they were meeting still on August 14th about how to evacuate Afghanistan, and it fell to the Taliban on August 15th. On August 30th, we'd already sent the FOIA to the State Department, people within the State Department, Department of Defense, other agencies as well, including CENTCOM, and now we're in federal court. But we filed, within less than 2 weeks of those meetings, we had already filed those FOIAs.
And, Jordan, we're entitled to those documents. That's why we're insisting on them. And, look, we basically want to know why the things that we've talked about today weren't considered in a plan readjusted. If you couldn't get the Americans out, if you couldn't get your allies out, if you couldn't get the people who served alongside of us out, if you couldn't evacuate the very important and sophisticated equipment so that it didn't fall into the hands of the enemy, then you just can't leave on that date certain. Those are the documents that we want, Jordan, and we want to know who involved, who had the sacred obligation to do this job and had that information and push forward with the decision anyway. I mean, look, ultimately this is on the commander-in-chief's desk, but Jordan, there are a ton of people inside these agencies who also would have had access to this information.
I sure want to hear from, and we have already, some military men and women that either served in Afghanistan or Iraq or have family members that did, and get your reaction to all this. 1-800-684-3110. But there's an interesting situation, because I'm going to pivot right now to the situation that we're dealing with with the United States is having to deal with Russia and Ukraine. So Russia, and this is, the word has been imminent. The word has been coming from the White House. It's an imminent attack of the Russians to the Ukrainians. There was that quasi-invitation in. Well, if they only take a little bit, maybe we won't react. And then there was an inconsistent statement made at the United Nations. So this was in a press conference yesterday. Jen Psaki was asked a question by a reporter. Take a listen.
Last week, I believe in here you said that the assessment still was that a Russian invasion is imminent. That's the word that you had used before, that other officials have used, and you used it last week. But yesterday, the ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, said she would not use the word imminent. She said she does not think of Russian invasion of Ukraine as imminent. So I guess we just need some clarification on where that assessment stands right now.
I used that once. I think others have used that once, and then we stopped using it because I think it sent in a message that we weren't intending to send, which was that we knew that President Putin had made a decision.
Wes?
The imminent predictions are not, they're not just coming from President Biden or Jen Psaki. These predictions have come from our military. They're looking at situation on the ground. They're looking at satellite photos. They're looking at the fact that the troops continue to go and surround Ukraine on 3 different sides, that Putin is now moving field hospitals and blood and plasma supplies to the border of Ukraine, which you don't need in a training exercise in large quantities. It's the military who really believe, and his intelligence, that this is imminent. More than likely, when Jen Psaki used that term, it's because the military had briefed her on it.
So then the question is, why are they now? They're being challenged on it because they put the U.S. ambassador in the United Nations. They put her out there to make that statement, to de-escalate things. So there's a reason.
Well, I think that, listen, the world has said to the U.S., stop. I mean, you had the Ukrainian president say, stop calling this imminent. Don't use SAC. Don't start acting like Kiev's going to be overrun. Now, whether or not that world is right on it, that is where the world's position has been. And the people who live in the backyard of Ukraine, their position has been, you're basically, remember, I mean, President Biden was going to say it's a given.
Yes.
It's a done deal that they're going to invade. The question is just how far they go. And now they're starting to walk back and I think that's, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I think that there is also, how do you want to play Putin? So if you keep forcing his hand, saying like he must invade, or maybe you're trying to play down that whatever he does is not what you talked about, so it's not as bad. Like you said, it's a smaller invasion. But the world clearly did not like this U.S. drumbeat of war. And that's how it felt. Right or wrong, it felt like our government was beating the drum of war. Yesterday, it was just yesterday we were talking about the troops.
Right.
That's just yesterday. They're beating the drum beats of war. We're spending it, sending in forces from Fort Bragg. We've got 8,000 more we can send. And the Ukrainians have said
we were reinforcing NATO. I mean, that was a big thing. We're going to reinforce NATO.
We were going to do it bilaterally because NATO was not being stood up.
Right.
And would not come together in agreement. And by the way, so no indication that they have.
And there are some political considerations involved here, I know as well, because the president of Ukraine, he has asked the administrations to stop saying imminent because he says it will create panic, it'll affect their economy. And so I think that's part of the reason they're probably trying to soft pedal it. I don't think the intelligence has changed. Actually, the intelligence still indicates that an invasion is likely, but there are political considerations.
It probably was the wrong thing, in hindsight, was addressing it the way that the United States addressed it.
Yeah, if you know your enemy's about to do something, it's probably best you don't tell the enemy that you know that.
Yeah,
that's
that doesn't
101.
And we did not have unity within NATO, and still don't.
Well, and I this is again, this is a skeptic's perspective, but as I'm watching John Kirby right now on TV talk about the ISIS leader being killed, I'm starting to think it's a bit of like, okay, but that's great. This one guy who I'm not sure what kind of influence he had. I need to go back.
It's good.
It is good. But yesterday you were drumbeating troops that they're not going inside Ukraine, but they're going to Poland, they're going to Romania, they're going to our NATO allies. And I feel like this is could be being utilized right now as a way to take attention off that. Now the media is not going to allow that. All the media is in Ukraine. I think that whatever they'd like to shift on it, like Jen Psaki said, we're not going to use imminent anymore. They're not going to be able to backtrack too much, and their actions speak louder than their words. But I do think they're going to probably try to play up this ISIS. Not that that's a bad thing, because it's a good message to send to terrorists, but try to shift some discussion from the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it's interesting because Admiral Kirby's speaking, and I mean, he's not been a confidence builder. Let's be honest on this.
I have no idea how he got this job back again.
Well, because he did it before, and
it's weird. Usually people don't go back for the same job.
He did. So there he is, and no disrespect to him, except that when you're listening to these guys, it doesn't build confidence. So my question, I guess, is, and I'll throw this up to Than, or my thought is, we have a situation right now where we had a successful operation yesterday in Syria. Great. That is very good. We have a difficult situation in Ukraine. I'll say it that way. Maybe not. They don't want us to, nobody should use the word imminent. That's the words coming out, whatever it might be.
China and Taiwan. The Russians and the Chinese and the Japanese are worried about North Korea, and of course the South Koreans are too. And I'm just wondering, is the White House focusing on these issues the way they should be focusing on them? Because when you get that memo that is now out about the fall of Afghanistan, and they're figuring out hours before when to start notifying people, that is not exactly what I would call a confidence-building measure.
Well, Jay, unfortunately, I think actually you invoking China is right on point here, because I think that the White House's ability to impact deterrence here is waning. I mean, look, there was a moment during this process where economic sanctions, including the ones that the Senate was putting forward, would have had a very big impact on Vladimir Putin. I mean, economic sanctions from the United States are significant when it comes to Russia. But if you publicly have the backing of President Xi of China, as it now appears that Vladimir Putin does, the impact of those sanctions, while still significant, Jay, they wane quite a bit. So, even if the White House were to circle back now and get really focused and take some punitive actions, they just don't have the stinging effect that they would have had a month ago when, in my view, they should have been done. So even if they circle back to him now, if President Xi comes out and says, we'll fill that void, Vladimir Putin might not care as much if the United States put those in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, again, the main issue here is that all of this ties back together to it's not the military, it's the non-military spokespeople, it's the White House spokespeople who build in drumbeats of war. To me, it's the same as what they're doing in Ukraine. And what the problem has been throughout this administration, I think, Wes, is that they don't explain to the American people the mission. No. They didn't. In Afghanistan, it was unclear. Mm-hmm. I mean, we knew withdrawal, and there was widespread support for that. Yes. So instead of saying, "Hey, we got widespread support for it. Let's make sure we do a great withdrawal," it was all muddled, and they weren't trusting each other's intel. Same with Ukraine. It's not that the American people don't want to do the right thing, but if you don't explain to us why we got troops going there, why are we beating this drumbeat of war, why was it imminent last week, but it's not imminent this week, and words, these words need to be carefully utilized when they speak for the White House, when they speak for the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it makes the American people rightfully skeptical because you don't exactly know what to believe and when they're telling the truth, when they're hedging, the truth a little bit. And the other thing about the administration too is that when they are questioned, it seems like their go-to position is to become defensive. And that does not, make people trust you either. When you're asked a simple question, answer the question if you can. If for security reasons, intelligence security, you can't answer it, you say that, but be honest about it. Don't spin it, and don't become defensive, and don't lie.
In our final segment, I'd love to hear from people who served in Afghanistan. You don't have to currently be serving, but if you serve there in this and all this news that's coming out now, 1-800-684-3110. And always, you can see our FOIA. You can see the federal lawsuit that we filed less than 2 weeks after they were still trying to figure out Kabul was falling at ACLJ.org.
It's important to really take a step back because we're talking about something that has been going on here for the last 20 years in Afghanistan that was really instigated, that began with the Islamist jihadist attack and declaration of war against our country on 9/11. Like so many people, that day changed my life. And it's really what was the determining factor for me personally to make a decision to enlist in the military. Initially, we went to Afghanistan. Our special operations forces were sent there to go after and defeat al-Qaeda, which they did effectively and decisively and quickly. Instead of staying focused on that mission of both militarily and ideologically defeating this Islamist jihadist threat and terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and so on, our leaders got distracted. The results and the consequences of this is al-Qaeda is stronger today than they were before they attacked us on 9/11. We've seen countless lives lost, American lives and the lives of people in these countries, trillions of American taxpayer dollars spent. We've seen how Christians and religious minorities in many of these countries who were previously protected have either been killed or driven out because of this Islamist jihadist threat. What we've seen play out in Afghanistan recently is the latest consequence of failed leadership.
Now what we have, I think, are frustrated Americans
watching as political timelines dictated our 20-year withdrawal from Afghanistan. We didn't do it on our timeline. We did it when the Taliban said, get out. We did it messy. We left 10% of the Americans there. And I never thought I would see a day when the President of the United States would be proud to say, I got 90% of the Americans out. But that's exactly what President Biden is saying.
And we're starting to get more and more congressional reaction. And I want to play, this is from a Republican from Wisconsin, Congressman Mike Gallagher. He's on the House Armed Services Committee.
About the diplomatic failures.
He was just asked again about, they're just being asked about this because these reports are now out. You don't have to speculate about their failure of withdrawal now. You know.
This is on Afghanistan, so people understand what we're talking about here. There's information now coming out about the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that in the Situation Room, the day before Kabul fell, they were still trying to figure out in what order they should notify and prioritize things while the country was literally falling.
While the Taliban was marching through the entire country, and the next place was Kabul, they were being warned as early as February. They were talking about August. And people kept warning them, kept coming back, saying, you got to start moving and moving. They weren't. But listen to Congressman Mike Gallagher, his reaction. Again, these are members of committees that play an important role. This is the House Armed Services Committee member, Bite Ford.
We now know they had one meeting preparing for the withdrawal. That's completely unsatisfactory. They were asleep at the wheel. Our Secretary of State was on vacation in the Hamptons. This is embarrassing. And the buck ultimately stops with Biden. The president is still unrepentant about his actions in Afghanistan. A few weeks ago, he said, I don't apologize for anything in Afghanistan. And that's really what worries me, okay? Shocks happen to every administration. Mistakes are made. You have to learn from those mistakes. But this administration seems intent on pushing full steam with this approach. And I think it's fair to say our weakness in Afghanistan, the collapse of our position, is undermining our posture in other areas of the world, right now in Ukraine, and I fear over the long term with China.
And I think that the last part of what the congressman said, I think, is really critical. And that is this notion, this idea that you have, by the failure in Afghanistan, you have emboldened our enemies. And that's something you always have to be very cautious of.
Absolutely. And this is exactly what's happening. I mean, under the previous administration, China and Russia, they sort of kept their heads down a little bit. We have Putin watching us. We have Xi and China watching us. They're becoming more and more belligerent, both in their actions and their rhetoric. North Korea is firing missiles and threatening to do another nuclear test. Iran is still in the picture, and China, Russia, and Iran started last week doing joint military exercises in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. I mean, weakness or even perceived weakness, it invites bad actions from your adversaries.
Brandon on Facebook asked a very interesting question. He said, I don't understand why these people, he's talking about the terrorists, chose to blow themselves up. Why is that their choice? And there's a theological reason for this, unfortunately, within Islam. In Christianity, God so loved mankind that he sent his own son to die for us. In Islam, there's this reverse idea of, so they look at this as their way to heaven.
Yeah.
Martyrdom.
Martyrdom. That is the highest human achievement, to be a martyr for Islam. And so they see that, and they see a great reward for doing that. And quite frankly, also in the Middle East, it's just a much more violent culture. They've seen a lot of violence. They some of them commit a lot of violence. And so blowing yourself up and blowing up your children and your wife or your wives is not seen as a bad thing by some of these radical Islamic terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately. Now, Dan, the question becomes, you look at it and you say, hey, wait a minute. You got Republicans and Democrats agreeing on something here. What can be done? Now, the truth is the executive branch is in charge of foreign policy. That's the way the Constitution is structured. So they could talk, but can they take any action? We're going to find out what happened through our litigation, but can they do anything?
Well, the administration may get to make this decision, Jay, but the rest of us, Congress has a lot of authority, but the rest of us, even on the outside, we have an ability to see who and why made those decisions with some limited exceptions. Jay, and this goes back to what we talked about a second ago. We don't have to speculate anymore about the ramifications, about the consequences, but there are some things we don't know. We don't know necessarily who reviewed the information, who saw that this was going to happen, and chose to push it aside. That's what we want to know. That's what we demanded in the litigation. We're due a response from the government, Jay, on February 11th. Now, we all know how these things work. This is going to be a long process, but we're going to stick at it, and we're going to stick at it for the reason that you mentioned earlier in the broadcast. This is a travesty, and you can't put some of that toothpaste back in the tube. But, Jay, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. It just can't happen again, and the people responsible need to be held accountable.
So Deborah on Facebook wrote in, my son served in Afghanistan. He felt safe under Trump, but not under Biden and Obama. Thank God he's back now. But he's sick knowing how much of our equipment was left there. I mean, so those who served there, who had friends and their brothers and sisters in arms killed there, losing life while defeating groups like Al-Qaeda, while taking out these terror groups and pushing back the Taliban into the hills and into the caves. Now, no, the Taliban is armed like we were.
Not only are they armed like we were, but we left significant ammunition, significant aircraft that have modern technology. And here's one of the problems. The Chinese government came into Afghanistan immediately. And guess what they want to know, Wes, right? They want to know what's in that U.S. military.
Yeah, our equipment, our technology has been compromised. And that is a fact that you just mentioned. China and Russia both have sent representatives to examine our ammunition and equipment there. Yeah.
Now, we have some breaking news on Ukraine and Russia. This is interesting. Maybe this is why the U.S. has changed some of their tone. This just came out of the New York Times, though. The United States has acquired intelligence about a Russian plan to fabricate a pretext for an invasion of Ukraine using a faked video that would build on recent disinformation campaigns. The plan, which the United States hopes to spoil by making public now, involves the Russians staging and filming a fabricated attack by the Ukrainian military, either on Russian territory or against the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. Russia, the U.S. official said, intended to use the video to accuse Ukraine of genocide against Russian-speaking people, then use the outrage over the video to justify an attack or have the separatist Russian leaders in that Donbass, eastern Ukraine region to invite Russian intervention.
So what's interesting about that is, assuming the New York Times has us correct, is that's where your intelligence makes a big difference. You could have thwarted that doesn't mean that they won't try to do something else.
But at least one of their plans.
But if that was one of their plans, that was pretty good intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And some intelligence analysts have been predicting this kind of thing for several weeks now.
But to actually get it.
Yeah, to actually get the intel that they're actually doing this. And also the United Kingdom Intel Services just last week reported that they had already been planning a puppet government and naming people who he would send to Kiev to actually be part of that government.
You know what it tells you? And this is what it tells you. Even with I said this at the beginning of the broadcast, I'm going to say it at the end. Even with all the political strife, and there is a lot of political strife, we live in the greatest country in the world. The United States of America is the greatest country in the world, one of the best military in the world, and great intelligence gathering capabilities. When deployed correctly, if this report in the New York Times proves to be correct, this was a major thing, a major issue, a major engagement. And maybe the thwarting of what the Russians, doesn't mean they won't come up with something else. They're going to deny it immediately, I'm sure. But the fact that came up, Jordan, that was a big deal.
Yeah, people have been talking about these false flag events by Russia to justify an invasion. This is very specific. Video to look like Russians speakers inside Ukraine were being systematically killed by Ukrainians. And then it would encourage even those Russian separatist groups to say, there needs to be an invasion by the Russian forces, not just the pro-Russian Ukraine forces. So, I mean, again, when intel is utilized correctly, I think Dan put in our chat right, when it's utilized correctly, it could prevent or at least cause trouble for those trying to plan bad actions and war. But when you don't take it to light, like in Kabul and that intel, it could also lead to chaos. So you've got to trust your intel and utilize it. We'll talk to you tomorrow on Sekulow. As always, check out ACLJ.org.